All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody here in the room and those of you who are joining us by Zoom. We're ending the year, and this is a great way to end the year in celebrating another one of our senior faculty, before we all break for the holidays. And I hope everybody is planning, now that we have that week between Christmas and New Year's, hopefully people will take advantage of that and take some well-deserved break and enjoy the holiday. We're thrilled, again, to honor one of our senior faculty. I want to, Kerry Schulze, and I want to begin by recognizing that we're very pleased to have her husband, Doug, with us, and her daughter, Anya. I'm told her son is in class where he should be, so we'll give him a break on that. But it's great to have you here, and welcome to the school, and welcome to this special lecture. When the Dean's Lecture was first established many, many years ago, it gave us a chance to highlight the work of our newly appointed and promoted professors. But as of last spring, we expanded the program to feature our senior scientists as well. And we're very excited about this change, and it gives us a chance to hear from more voices at our school and to really highlight and honor the exceptional scientists who are leaders in their field and working with us closely on a number of different programs. Today marks the second time we've had a senior scientist honored and deliver a Dean's Lecture, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kerry Schulze. Kerry is a member of the Department of International Health in the Division of Human Nutrition. She's an expert in micronutrient status biomarkers, and she directs the lab that provides crucial support to our school's nutrition work. I'm guessing most of you have had your lunch today without thinking much about the micronutrients you were taking in. But as Kerry can tell you, and we'll learn more about that in her talk, those micronutrients are so very important to our health. But in many places of the world, as many of you know, micronutrient deficiencies really take their toll. They can disrupt pregnancy, impair child development, and increase the risk of chronic disease. The good news is that there's a lot that public health can do about this, and has provided powerful solutions to these deficiencies. As I'm sure you know, the study of nutrition has a very long and rich history here at the School of Public Health. Over a century ago, Evie McCullum, our first chair of the biochemistry department, discovered vitamin A and co-discovered vitamin D, and this was in the 70s and 80s. Al Summers showed that a simple vitamin A supplement could save the eyesight and lives of millions of children. And in more recent years, Keith West, Perul Christian, and others have led a series of large population-based trials in Nepal and Bangladesh that have shown what types of nutritional interventions can lower maternal and infant mortality. Kerry plays a vital role in our school's ongoing work in this important area to protect health and save lives by advancing nutrition. She is particularly focused on undernourished women, infants, children, and adolescents, participating in some of our major trials as well as other research initiatives. As just one example, Kerry is currently working on the project Assessing Hidden Hunger through plasma proteomics, which I'm particularly interested in. It's led by Keith West and funded by our SciBar program, the school's initiative that aims to advance team science and integrate theory with practice. Using archived specimens, Keith, Kerry, and their colleagues are working to identify new biomarkers of micronutrient status that could be analyzed using a single platform. This would improve the efficiency of our studies in this particular area and opening the doors for new discoveries and advances. Now, as I mentioned, Kerry is responsible for directing a research laboratory at the school, which has expertise in measuring a variety of micronutrient biomarkers. The lab supports not only her own research, but that of other program faculty and collaborators, serving as a technical resource for the trials and follow-up surveys that our faculty have conducted in Nepal, Bangladesh, and elsewhere over the many years. There are now samples from over 10,000 women and children maintained in the nutrition lab. Often participants have been followed up multiple times within a trial or across even larger periods of time, meaning that in some cases we have samples of mothers and children and their offspring in infancy as well as adolescence. So it's a very, very rich data source. They are a tremendous source of potential new knowledge as we look to the next era of nutrition discoveries and interventions. The lab has come a long way under Kerry's leadership, as was true for many of our lab directors in this school. When COVID hit, she kept things running and kept things safe. She looked after and supported her personnel, and she added new instrumentation and ensured the lab's work did not waver, even in the face of a pandemic. She excelled in the face of great challenges. In addition to her work as a researcher and a scientist, Kerry is much admired as a teacher and mentor, and has been recognized for her excellence in these areas. She is committed to the staff in her lab and passionate about building strong collaborative teams. Through all of this work and more, Kerry is opening new avenues to help nutritionally compromised people around the world, particularly during their core moments of life and development. In many parts of the world, pregnancy and childhood are still perilous, and better nutrition is a crucial step towards changing that. It is a fundamental building block to helping families and communities thrive. We are grateful to Kerry for her work to unleash the power of good nutrition to all those in need. Kerry, thank you so much for all you do, and we are just so excited to hear from you today. So the floor is all yours.
So, well, thank you for that very kind introduction. Today, I'm primarily going to talk about micronutrient distributions among mothers and infants from the Javita 3 trial in Bangladesh. And as you know, we can think of distributions as statistical summaries, but more importantly, we want to be thinking about how micronutrients are allocated within and between mothers and infants across a reproductive event. So the work I especially want to highlight was done over the past 2.5 years, since that was such a challenging time. But to get there, we'll have to refer back to data that was actually generated over the 10 years prior to that, and even longer. So it will actually be 30 years this spring when I joined the Human Nutrition Program, first as a lab technician, then a PhD student, then in my role as faculty. So in a sense, this is a bit of an anniversary lecture for me as well. I wanted to go way back in time and just mention a bit about my educational journey, since it's been such a strong influence on where I've gotten to in my career. So Dean McKenzie mentioned the School of Public Health's illustrious history with respect to the discovery of vitamins. But actually, I started my academic journey at the University of Wisconsin, where E.V. McCollum started his career before coming to Hopkins, and where the discovery of vitamin A began. And you can see from this Alumni Magazine article sort of proudly announcing that fact. So this article was featured some time ago with this image of this elf-like vitamin A in it. And when I contacted the university archives, they sent me additional photos of even more vitamin in these comic book type volumes, even including a holiday card. So of course, now we're particularly concerned actually with Vita women and Vita children. But in any case, while I probably didn't appreciate it at the time, some of the most fundamental discoveries around a variety of vitamins, including A, D, and so on were actually conducted at the University of Wisconsin. And I'd like to think that I internalized some of that legacy following Evie McCullum's footsteps here to the School of Public Health. I then did a master's at Cornell with Kathy Rasmussen, who's been a leader in the field of nutrition and lactation. This is the first paper I published with a title that actually fails to mention that the work was done in rats. I spent many hours and days in the rat room with fellow student Shelley McGuire, who remains a dear friend and collaborator on recent work, and Becky Stoltzfus, who was also a student of Kathy's, was the person who I essentially connected me with Hopkins. Now, while at Cornell, I grew to appreciate that if you really want to understand pregnancy and lactation and growth, you need to work with animal scientists, because this is exactly what they do. Dale Bauman, who was a dairy scientist, was on my thesis committee, and he co-authored this article describing homeoresis, or the orchestrated changes to support the priorities of a physiological state, so including pregnancy, lactation, and growth. So this concept remains central to how we think about the movement of nutrients through biological systems during these key periods of life. So then, here at Hopkins, after a few years as a lab technician, I went back as a student and did my PhD with Kimberly O'Brien. Here we were using stable isotopes of calcium to characterize calcium absorption, losses, and deposition into bone during early, peak, and late puberty in girls with cystic fibrosis. And this is a condition that results in delayed puberty and compromised growth. So here we were actually, demonstrating this concept of homeoresis in action. That is the extent to which calcium, which is the major mineral of bone, was absorbed, retained, and essentially moved into bone over this critical period of growth. So the images on the left are publications from that study. The image on the right, I would love to say that was mine, but when I went back to look at kind of my thesis and the diagrams that I used in old PowerPoint presentations, it just didn't convey exactly what this beautiful diagram does. This is from a more recent publication by Kim O'Brien and Steve Abrams, who are really leaders in this field. I was in touch with Kim the other day, and she noted that it's been about 20 years since I finished my PhD, so yet another anniversary to celebrate. So, with a background in vitamins and minerals, reproduction and growth, and this concept of homeoresis, or nutrients moving through systems in an orchestrated manner to support these biological events, and nearly 30 years here, it's only natural that my career would look something like this. If I try to talk through this, it will take me the entire rest of the seminar. But I wanted to really emphasize that the research I've been involved with really clusters around these areas of pregnancy and early lactation, with some of the major vitamin and mineral intervention trials, micronutrient intervention trials that have been done in Nepal and Bangladesh. Those have fostered follow-up studies where we've actually followed children into, as Dean McKenzie mentioned, into their school-age years and adolescence. Bioarchives have also led to a whole variety of opportunities, kind of in the square at the top of this figure, and including the proteomic biomarker development activities that Dean McKenzie mentioned as well. Following on to the pregnancy and lactation trials, there have been a series of feeding trials and or studies looking at gut health and its influence on growth in young children, and I've been involved in a variety of those as well. So, and just to point out that the studies marked with an asterisk are ones that I'll come back to later in the talk. And people often ask me as a lab person if I've been able to travel to some of these sites. And in fact, anything that is bolded are studies that I've been able to support on the ground. So that support includes helping with assay development and evaluating lab data quality at some of our collaborating labs, training field workers in biospecimen collection procedures, dosing studies for body composition, and gut permeability assessment in women and infants or children, respectively. Training in biospecimen processing, planning and supporting study supply and cold chains, working with our field and data management teams to integrate biospecimen collection visits with field and data workflows, working on data collection forms and training in anthropometry dietary data collection in places including Nepal, Bangladesh, Thailand, Zambia, Nigeria, Kenya, which doesn't appear on here for the PMA 2020 nutrition module, and then going back even further, Zanzibar, Indonesia, and Peru. So it's been just really an honor for me to be able to support these kind of activities really around the globe. And it's one thing about my position over the last, couple decades that I have, that I most cherish. These experiences, while often quite challenging, have always been special and incredibly inspiring. So with that as sort of the big picture background, I wanted to take you now to rural northwest Bangladesh and orient you to the Javita project site, which is shown in the pink area of the map blow up here of Bangladesh. So Javita encompasses over 400 square kilometers and a population of over 500,000 people. So it's rural, but incredibly population dense. The site was selected over 20 years ago now due to its regional representation with respect to infrastructure, demography, diet, and other factors. And Keith West, Parul Christian, Alan Labreek were on the ground floor to select the site that we've all been working in for the last couple decades now. The site's supported by an amazing local team that it's been my great honor to work with over the years. And it's been here that the Javita 3 trial of antenatal multiple micronutrient versus iron folic acid supplementation was conducted just over a decade ago, from about 2008 to 2012. Results from the main trial were published in 2014. This is the cover page of the manuscript. And among over 28,000 live births, the multiple micronutrient supplement compared to iron folic acid alone reduced stillbirth, preterm, and low birth weight, and increased the time that infants spent in utero, resulting in infants who were born 54 grams heavier and larger in size overall. So these beneficial birth outcomes have contributed to a considerable body of evidence in support of the provision of multiple micronutrients over iron folic acid, which has been the standard of care worldwide. So in the trial, women received at random either iron and folic acid or a multiple micronutrient supplement from very early in pregnancy, about 10 weeks of gestational age, through 3 months postpartum. And the trial supplements contain the same amounts of iron and folic acid, as you can see in the table over there, but the multiple micronutrient supplement contained 1 RDA amounts of 13 other nutrients. And an RDA, or recommended dietary allowance, is intended to meet the nutritional requirements of nearly everyone in a healthy population group when consumed on a daily basis. It's notable that the RDA, the recommendation for vitamin D, actually tripled since the time we did this trial. And within the trial, women were invited to participate in a sub-study that entailed more intensive data and biospecimen collection based on their area of residence within the larger field site. So about 1,500 women ended up contributing serial biospecimens, including plasma from venipuncture at baseline before they received any micronutrients, at 32 weeks of gestation, so in late pregnancy, and then at 3 months postpartum when breast milk and infant serum or infant plasma was collected as well. Cord blood was collected in a further subset of infants at the time of delivery in another sub-study that was overseen by Parul Christian and her PhD student, Alison Gernand. So that was quite an impressive undertaking in that environment where the vast majority of these deliveries happened in people's homes. So incredibly valuable data. And to date, we have published findings on the effect of the multiple micronutrient supplement on micronutrient status of mothers during pregnancy in relation to the baseline biospecimen collection time point, and on the newborns at the time of delivery based on the cord blood relative to the mom's plasma micronutrient biomarkers in late pregnancy. But it's only been relatively recently that we've been able to tackle the postpartum data. And so we started with a pilot study in 2018 that led to a supplement that started in 2020, where we were able to look more comprehensively at micronutrient status data across maternal plasma, milk, and infant plasma samples. And we affectionately call that study JIMMY. So JIMMY stands for the Javita-3 iron folic acid versus multiple micronutrients in milk for infants study. So it's a nice sort of acronym with a I don't know, kind of meaningful to me at this point. So, and Jimmy followed on this pilot work that was done in a much smaller group of breast milk samples from between 2018 and 2019. And so it kicked off in April 2020, just of course, as everything was shutting down. And despite that, we have been able to generate the data that is shown on this slide in all of these, the different mediums that were collected from women and infants from Javita-3 across maternal plasma, milk, and infant plasma. So I'm actually incredibly proud that we've been able to sort of to essentially finish this off with a little help from friends, including from Lindsay Allen's lab at the USDA at UC Davis, and as well friends at University of Idaho, and metabolomics work that was done at Sapient Bioanalytics. So what I really want to focus on today is some of the data that I'm most excited about, and that's data that was generated in the infants. And in particular, we'll be looking at vitamin data, so the fat-soluble vitamins A, E, and D, and then vitamin B12. But first we need to go back and sort of catch up. So we're going to go back to early pregnancy. This plot here shows the prevalence of the micronutrient deficiencies among Javita-3 participants based on data that was published in that very first Journal of Nutrition paper. So you can see from this figure that in early pregnancy, before any intervention, first of all, you see balance across the intervention groups, which is good. And you can also see that women are starting their pregnancies most deficient in vitamins B12, E, and D. And although fewer than 10% of women were vitamin A deficient, about 40% had marginal status that could ultimately put them at risk of deficiency. So among other biomarkers, we can also see that anemia was prevalent among these women, but essentially iron and folate deficiencies were not. So this does suggest that, deficiencies other than iron and folic acid iron and folate were the most problematic in this setting. So at 32 weeks gestation, the multiple micronutrient supplement did result in better status than iron folic acid for many of these nutrients. And you can see where the asterisks demonstrate that the prevalence of deficiency of these conditions declined. But overall, the prevalence of deficiencies other than for vitamins D and E actually increased. And vitamin D and E are kind of funny, and we'll come back to those. So this, the fact that deficiencies remained even with when the multiple micronutrient supplement was provided, and we actually did find that they were most likely to persist among those who started their pregnancies in a deficient state, led us to conclude, first of all, that poor status was most common for micronutrients other than iron and folate, providing a strong impetus for provision of nutritional support beyond IFA. And secondly, that earlier intervention or higher micronutrient contents might be warranted to prepare women for the nutritional demands of pregnancy in settings in which micronutrient deficiencies are common, wide-ranging, and confer risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes to women and their offspring. And so really this work has prompted additional trials, one a preconceptional trial and one a dosing trial where we will look at higher doses of micronutrients within the Bangladesh setting, and I'll come back and talk a little bit more about those. But we need to acknowledge that there are challenges in assessing micronutrient status during pregnancy. So in addition to reflecting the additional demands on a woman's own nurture during pregnancy, micronutrient biomarkers can change during pregnancy for reasons unrelated to maternal status, including plasma volume expansion that occurs during pregnancy, which could explain some of the decline that we see here in vitamins B12 and retinol for vitamin A. So what this graph shows is the percent change in biomarkers from early to late pregnancy by the intervention groups. So both B12 and vitamin A are declining regardless of retinol, that decline is prevented by the multiple micronutrient supplement. But whether or how to account for plasma volume expansion is really unresolved. It's not readily measured and isn't necessarily applicable to all nutrients. Other physiological adaptations to pregnancy, like changes in lipid metabolism, are related to the dramatic increases that you see here in alpha tocopherol that are observed during pregnancy. And finally, with respect to vitamin D, you can see that there was really no change, at least in the IFA group over the course of pregnancy, likely because vitamin D status is really influenced mostly by sun exposure and season. While gains of, we do see gains of over 10% in the multiple micronutrient group. So vitamin D status is responsive to that, the vitamin D in the multiple micronutrient supplement. So the transfer of nutrients to the fetus, particularly for those nutrients for which fetal demand overrides nutritional status, could also be associated with declines in circulating maternal biomarkers. And that might be the case for B12. We'll see that in a moment. The lesson I take away is it's really important to understand the story behind each nutrient, sort of what the physiological mechanisms are sort of underlying what's going on during pregnancy. The next slide is going to address some of the unseen roles of micronutrients and earlier in fetal development, and then we're going to return and look at what we can interpret from the cord blood results. So to address the issue of some of the functional roles of micronutrients across pregnancy, particularly as pertains to fetal development, a group of us, and long-term effects on the offspring, a group of us, including former PhD students Alison Gernand and Christine Stewart, published this review several years ago. This figure is a summary of the section that I worked on, with findings derived from the experimental and animal literature to describe some of the most appreciated roles for micronutrients in placental, which is in the yellow here, and fetal development, I guess in the beige or the brown bar, and looking across pregnancy from the very earliest stages of around the time of conception onward. And so here you can see that nutrients can play multiple roles at different time points during gestation. For example, you'll see vitamin E is linked to functions in the placenta. So it acts as an antioxidant, as well as during early development of the embryo. As is vitamin A involved in early embryonic development. Vitamin B12, you see several times here, including very early during the time of implantation, as well as during neurological development, and so on. So these functions are occurring or tend to occur in the first half of pregnancy, while then the transfer of nutrients to support the nutritional status of the newborn occurs later. And here we characterized the transfer of micronutrients from mother to fetus in late pregnancy by relating the cord blood biomarker values to that which we measured in maternal plasma during late pregnancy, which is on the x-axis. And you can see that broadly across our nutrients of interest, two very distinct patterns emerge. So for vitamin E, which are on the left, you can see very weak or modest associations between maternal and infant concentrations of these nutrients in cord blood, really regardless of maternal status. And for vitamin A, infants are known to be born with low stores, and are known to be dependent on colostrum and milk to support their status early in life. For vitamin E, it's also known that there's relatively limited transfer to the fetus. But what is circulating in cord blood, there's really less information here. What's circulating in cord blood might not reflect vitamin E that has been stored in other tissues like red blood cells, for example. But it is known that colostrum and milk are also important sources of vitamin E for the neonate. For vitamins D and B12, on the other hand, strong associations of neonatal with maternal status exist. Newborn 25-hydroxyvitamin D concentrations are about 80% those of the mothers. And because vitamin D content of milk is low, it's thought to be important to optimize what is transferred in utero. Infants are at risk of rickets if they're vitamin D deficient in early life. So, and one other sort of interesting thing about the vitamin D relationship here is it's the only place where we see an independent effect of the multiple micronutrient supplement on the cord blood values. And it's not terribly strong. You can see these, the solid and the dotted line there that are trying to capture that relationship, but it is statistically significant. Finally, with respect to vitamin B12, only for vitamin B12 were cord blood concentrations higher than those in the mother, and that is consistent with the active transport of vitamin B12 across the placenta. So again, sort of different distributions related to different nutrients. So we've made it through pregnancy to delivery, and now let's see how this plays out with respect to what's going on in the infants. And the next slides are really brand new data, so consider this preliminary. So with respect to maternal and infant characteristics, mothers were young, short, and commonly underweight, indicative of living with chronic malnutrition. So it's perhaps not surprising that infants are small. So at the 3 months postpartum, 24% of them were stunted, 6% were wasted. But the prevalence of these conditions is actually lowest at this 3-month postpartum time point relative to earlier and later visits where we collected anthropometry. And we do know that growth tends to begin to falter sometime between 3 and 6 months of age in low and middle income countries. So I think this is a really key time to be looking at what's going on in infants. The good news is that 85% of these infants were exclusively breastfeeding, and 90% of mothers perceived that they were producing enough milk to support their infants. On the other hand, about 40% of these infants had evidence of inflammation, as indicated by elevated alpha-1 acid glycoprotein, and with high rates of respiratory conditions related to that. So in terms of our micronutrient biomarkers at the 3-month postpartum time point, you can see within the iron folic acid group that retinol was considerably lower in infants than in mothers. But for vitamins D, E, and B12, the infant values were actually higher. And then when we look at the intervention effects, all these maternal responses remained significant with respect to the multiple micronutrient intervention. And this is the percent change or difference between concentrations of these biomarkers between the IFA and the multiple micronutrient groups. And you can also see that infants benefited as well. So with respect to their vitamin A, vitamin D, and B12 concentrations, not so vitamin E though. But this to me, I was really excited to see that the multiple micronutrient supplement directly benefited or had an impact, a measurable impact on what was going on with the infant biomarkers, suggesting that retaining some level of supplementation into the lactation period really can have important benefits for mothers and infants alike. Oops. Okay, so this is, I could get lost in these graphs. I'm so excited about them. And I don't see Josh Smith here, but he helped me pull these together. And they're a little bit complicated, but let's put that postpartum data into perspective with what we saw across pregnancy. And so this is in a very, relatively small subset, so we can actually look at this data longitudinally and show individual trajectories within mothers and infants. And I think what this captures is really the different orchestrations that happen across these different nutrients. And really, again, even though this is a small subset, the patterns hold with what we see if we were to look at cross sections across all of our data. The red lines are indicative of sort of the average values of the multiple micronutrient group, and the blue lines, the iron folic acid group. So in the top left for vitamin A, you can see that retinol values among mothers increase from that pregnancy visit into the postpartum visit, and particularly in the multiple micronutrient group. But among infants, concentrations of retinol are lower than those observed in the moms, and seem to decline a bit over those first 3 months of age. For vitamin D, over here, there's little change across pregnancy and into the postpartum period, although you can kind of barely see this improvement with the multiple micronutrient supplement. And but we see this really interesting doubling, essentially, of vitamin D concentrations in the infants, 25-hydroxyvitamin D. For vitamin E, the increase in alpha tocopherol we observed in mothers in late pregnancy resolved by 3 months postpartum, and that those very low values in the newborns increased to kind of meet where the mothers are at by 3 months of age. And then finally, for vitamin B12, those very high levels we saw at birth for the infants tend to decline over the first 3 months of life. If we try to put this in the context of defining deficiencies at three months postpartum using conventional cutoffs, we see a high prevalence of vitamin A deficiency among the infants, but not so the mothers. For vitamin D and B12, we see very little deficiency in the infants, but high prevalences in the mothers. And for vitamin E, high prevalences of deficiency for both. But this does make me sort of question whether we need to be rethinking or, what our cutoffs should be during these times when things are very fluid. So overall, having this data across time in the context of a trial with a nutritional intervention in a setting where nutritional status is known to be compromised, and at a time of life when infants are largely thought to be protected by exclusive breastfeeding, to me is really invaluable. So the postpartum data allows us to contextualize the specific effects of pregnancy on the micronutrient biomarkers. The fact that we see benefits of the multiple micronutrient supplement in both mothers and infants at 3 months postpartum, to me, supports extending nutritional supplementation into that period. The rapid changes in biomarker concentrations during pregnancy and early life in infancy suggests that I think we need to do more to really identify appropriate biomarker cutoffs, and to do that, we really need to understand more about the metabolism of these vitamins during these rapidly changing times. And with respect to, what is the role of breast milk and kind of the maternal infant diet. The benefit of generating this data in the context of the JAVITA 3 trials that we can explore other determinants of maternal and infant status, as well as link data to other outcomes among the wealth of data that has been collected. And additionally, as mentioned, all of this has led us to question whether we need to do more with respect to multiple micronutrient interventions and or start earlier. So what I've shown you thus far is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we can get out of the Jimmy study. We have 2 student-led manuscripts on infant mineral status, so iron and zinc status, that should go out the door shortly. We have an amazing amount of data on milk, vitamins and minerals, including extensive data on B vitamin content generated by Daniela Hempel in Lindsay Allen's lab. We have the smaller subset of samples in which data on the milk microbiome, human milk oligosaccharides, fatty acids, amino acids, and so on, have been generated in collaboration with Shelley and Mark McGuire and Janet Williams at University of Idaho and Lars Bode at UC San Diego. Our own Ethan Goff has been wading through literally tens of thousands of molecules, most unidentified, from the untargeted metabolomics analysis, using novel analytic approaches to elicit putative metabolic pathways in relation to infant growth, as well as in relation to our biomarkers. This figure on the right here, I'm not even going to try to tackle it. It's just an example of what has been pulled out of some of the metabolomics work. And so it gives you a sense of the complexity and the level of commitment it's going to take to fully take advantage of that data. I've mentioned that this work has in part motivated additional trials. So MINDER, or the Micronutrient Dose Response Trial, was funded early this year and will be an effort to test 4 levels of a variety of micronutrients among women of reproductive age and pregnant women in Bangladesh. In an effort to sort of target what kind of, what levels of micronutrients might be ideal to best support women during these critical periods of life. The JAVITA-5 trial tested preconceptional multiple micronutrient supplements versus a placebo in newly married women, most of them adolescents. And Keith West, as the PI of that trial, has been sharing those findings. That trial kind of also bumped up against the start of the pandemic, but the bulk of it had been finished. So JAVITA-3 early pregnancy samples are being used in the proteomics biomarker discovery study funded through the school's SciBar initiative, as was previously mentioned. And we have a wealth of data as well on adolescent growth, pubertal development, and micronutrient status from the JAVITA-1 cohort follow-up, fondly referred to as JICFU. And in that project, infants who had been born to mothers who participated in the JAVITA-1 trial, and that was a vitamin A or beta carotene placebo-controlled trial. It was done back around the year 2000 to 2007, something like that. They were visited as young adolescents in 2015 to 2017. Some of those have gone on to become participants in the JAVITA-5 trial. So we're, as mentioned, starting to be able to see participants actually across generations. I wanted to also highlight 2 recent publications because they represent to me very special collaborations. One on aflatoxin exposure in the JAVITA-3 mothers across pregnancy to their offspring at 2 years of age with Josh Smith, John Grootman, and folks from UC Davis and Malawi representing the Islands Dyad trial, which is another longitudinal trial from which another trial from which a longitudinal data set was available to look side by side at aflatoxin exposure with what we see in Bangladesh. So that the first paper from that was published last year. The other is sort of out of the realm of the JAVITA family, but a whole different family, which I greatly value. And this represents a longstanding collaboration with Julie Hoover-Fong, who's here. She's the director of the Greenberg Center for Skeletal Dysplasias across the street, and John McGrady in the Department of Biostats. And this particular paper, and it's one of many we've done over the years, uses data that was relatively recently consolidated from a multi-center cohort study to generate growth curves for children and adolescents who have achondroplasia, so a short stature skeletal dysplasia. So I'm incredibly proud of all the data that we've generated, particularly in the last 2.5 years, but really over as long as I've been here. We have a fantastic lab facility on the second floor, but it's really brought to life by the people who work there. Sarah Baker, who's standing with the Immulite there in the reddish sweater, is really my right-hand person. So she manages the lab and bioarchives on a day-to-day basis, does all our purchasing, supports field logistics, generates a ton of data, has an amazing memory and eye for detail, and I just could not do what I do without her. I don't know how she does it. She has a toddler at home too, and so just really appreciate her efforts. Kitty Stevenson, who's here, I hired 2 years ago, summer of 2020, from Jed Fahey's lab. Some of you know Jed. And she's been invaluable at method development and validation on the HPLC and UPLC, so some of our vitamin assays. No one works harder or digs deeper into how to get these assays to work. She's also a delight to work with, so I just love having her on the team. Ximing Ji, who was an MSPH student last year. I hired her this fall because she was just invaluable with respect to method development on our newest piece of instrumentation, the ICP mass spec. I make Li Wu an honorary lab member because she carefully reviews, archives, analyzes, and protects our data. I can't say enough about how much help she's been to me over the years. And this is just such a fantastic team of people that I just love working with, in addition to others who have contributed over the years, whose work I just really appreciate. We've been through our share of challenges during the last 2 years. We got booted out of our lab for the summer of 2020 for construction. We have lost a couple freezers along the way. There have been, COVID protocols to deal with and supply chain issues to deal with, and the installation of an instrument that was delayed. Air handling outages, so that just sent the temperatures in our freezer room up into the 90s. And this was how they started trying to deal with it, with little box fans. Finally, we got around to bringing in the big guns and managing the situation. That also sometimes put our ICP-MS out of whack. So there had been days where this whole crew of people had been in the lab sort of staring up at the ceiling, like, what do we do? And I just wanted to express my appreciation for the folks at facilities for backing us up and getting behind us during these challenging times. So with that, I really want to specifically acknowledge, in particular, Keith West, for all his support, encouragement, generosity, and mentorship over the years. I'm going to get a little weepy. I have my tissue. So, Parul for her leadership and many of the sort of new ideas that have generated new support and some really exciting studies. The entire Javita team that I've worked with over the years, and new people who are coming onto it. Really too many to put on a single slide, although I've put a whole bunch of names on this slide. The Javita organization has done such an amazing job of operating studies with the utmost integrity, such that study refusals are low and retention is high. And we just really appreciate overall the investment of the people who participate in these studies. It's particularly gratifying to work on studies that are so well received. I need to thank our finance and admin team because I am terrible at finance and admin. So I'm really grateful to them. And of course, to our funders, most recently the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but a series of other funders over the years. Some of you know it's been a particularly challenging time in our household, so I don't think I can read through this, but I'm going to let you guys read through it. Just special thanks to kind of everyone. And some in particulars, Andy Ruff, Keisha Porter Pollock, and David Peters for supporting time off when I needed it. Okay, this is the first time in many years that I have not been teaching nutritional status, assessment of nutritional status as a primary instructor. I just wanted to acknowledge that, the last couple of years have been really challenging, moving classes to the online and back to the in-class environment. So hats off to TAs. Thank you to students for their patience with all these transitions. And then special thanks to Bobby Bear and Erwin Shore, who've participated in assessment over the years, and Mika for taking it on this year. Same thing with critical thinking. Emma and Holly have been my TAs over the last couple of years. All the faculty who have participated in it to make it a great class, I really appreciate it. And those of you who invite me to participate in your class, thank you for doing so as well. And this is my almost last slide. I'm just going to say thanks to family and friends. I really do love you all. I appreciate those of you who have been able to join via Zoom. Those of you in the audience, thank you for your patience with me. I know I get a little weird sometimes, so, but I love you dearly. And just some closing thoughts. I pulled this quote, and again, I'm going to kind of let you all read it, and I'm going to regroup. But this felt really meaningful to me in terms of my sort of motivation for working in public health and my hope for the future. And I hope to see you all running down the hallways, touching the walls on both sides. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was extraordinary. It was wonderful in so many different ways. And it really shows the power of collaboration, number one. The collaborations you've built, it's just amazing, both here and in the countries you've worked in. And the collaboration of just persistence, especially over the last few years with many, many challenges. And, just the power of hope and your commitment to making the world a better place. So thank you for everything.
Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for questions. So I know Keith must have a question, right? Or 2 or 3 or 10.
Keith only had the briefest preview of this data, so.
Actually, I have lots of questions, but I don't know if I can ask any questions. You've even brought me to tears, Kerry. It just, behind every successful research team is an enormously talented, skilled, collaborative laboratory director and team. And one thing you didn't mention is that you've also guided the assays of collaborating institutions around the world, in Thailand, in Zambia, in Indonesia, You have in Nepal, you have provided those laboratories with assay directions. You've gone to those laboratories to standardize and to work with senior scientists in those facilities. And that didn't even get into your talk.
That got on the big slide. This is buried.
But let me thank you on behalf of so many that you work with and that I work with for the contributions that you've made over the years. It's an astounding talk, I agree, and I learned every time I listened to you, I learned a lot of new data and findings today as well. I'll save my questions for later.
Excellent.
And I'm sorry for those of you online somehow. You pushed the button.
Oh, did I?
Okay. Any other comments or questions? I agree. I mean, it's hard to. It was an incredible presentation. Really appreciate that.
Well, I do have
Thank
a
you.
question.
Okay.
Just don't press the button.
Okay. This way everybody can hear. Vitamin E levels
Yeah.
go up in pregnancy in the poorest of societies, and you showed that here. And then they go down after pregnancy. But the diet doesn't change.
Right.
So where does the vitamin E come from in circulation? The only thing that I can think of is that it is transferred out of maternal tissues to maintain the blood supply that nourishes the fetus with this critical nutrient. But any thoughts that you have on that would, I'm sure, be enlightening.
And while you're answering that question, you pushed it again. I don't know. While you're answering, thinking of the answer to that question, if anybody online has a question, please either raise your hand or send a message to Becky Newcomer in the chat.
So vitamin E is interesting and complicated, and as much as I showed here, there's way more that we could delve into. But so it's and I don't know the biology as well as I should, but it rides sort of this increase in lipids. So it's associated with the beta lipoprotein, and so. It's a redistribution during pregnancy that sort of follows where lipids go, and then it resolves over time. I think what's super interesting is what's going on in the infants, because the fact that those levels rise so quickly, and I mean, some of it's going to be due to what infants are getting in colostrum and milk. But I actually looked at, sort of comparing, the cord blood versus maternal status as a determinant of what's going on at 3 months. And even though those cord blood values looked really flat, cord blood was the major determinant of that increase at 3 months. And that's why I mentioned that, some of that vitamin E in cord blood probably isn't representing what got deposited into other infant tissues as well. So I think there are places that vitamin E is hiding, and that, kind of become, that we observe over these, the courses of these biological events that we don't understand very well. Among these nutrients, I would say vitamin E is the least well understood. So
Kim O'Brien has a question online.
Oh, Kim.
Hi, Kerry. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Great. Hi, Doug. Hi, Anya. So great to see you and watch you shine. Kerry, what an amazing amount of work. And I really commend you for being able to integrate so many aspects of maternal, fetal, and neonatal physiology, and for the body of work that you've generated. It's just wonderful. And to hear all the stuff that you've continued to do with Julie. I wanted to just kind of ask you two questions. One is related to your AJCN data, and it goes back to the issue of what form you should be looking at and what pool you should really be focusing on. And I wondered, when you're looking at iron in your AJCN paper, you didn't find any correlation between ferritin between the mom and the baby. But one of the really unanswered issues, and I think an important issue to address, is for some nutrients, the early redistribution and where those nutrients are located. And so for iron, it's mainly in hemoglobin. I wondered if in your data, if you've got more data on early dynamics and how ferritin, we have found in our studies that high hemoglobin is associated with low ferritin. So high ferritin is actually not good in the obstetric populations we look at in cord blood. So I wonder if you ever have explored other compartments or other dynamics of iron partitioning over early life. It might be interesting to explore in the very unique populations that you're working with. So that was one comment I wanted to make. And the other one is just kind of builds off what Keith just asked you and what you were answering about vitamin E, is looking at vitamin D dynamics and debinding protein. I wondered if you're measuring debinding protein in your populations.
Yeah, we haven't. I mean, there's lots more stuff I would love to measure. So that's actually a good point. Other things, I mean, there's other B12 biomarkers I would love to have, because I don't know that circulating, total B12 is necessarily telling us everything we'd like to know. But that's something I'll sort of take a look at and consider for down the road. With the sort of ferritin hemoglobin, are you talking about in the pregnant moms, or are you talking about in the infants?
In the babies. The babies load hemoglobin so they can breathe in utero. And our babies that have high hemoglobin have very low ferritin. And then over early life, very quickly, they catabolize the hemoglobin once they start breathing air, and all that iron then goes into their stores. So right at the moment, when you get the cord blood, I don't think you're seeing the same, that the ferritin measure is giving you the same information it's going to give you after a couple of weeks once the hemoglobin is catabolized. And then that iron goes into stores.
So we actually don't have hemoglobin in the cord blood for some reason. I don't know how we missed that, but so I can't look at that, dynamic right around the time of birth. At 3 months postpartum, we don't see an association of we see a really strong association of ferritin with rates of infant growth, but not with other indicators of iron status. So it seems to be sort of acting independently of that. And I would love to sit down and we could chat about some of these other details around some of these biomarkers. So thank you for those ideas.
I love that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Thanks, Kerry. And great job.
Erwin Shore online has a comment.
Erwin.
Yeah, hi, Kerry and everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today. I have ankle surgery tomorrow morning early and couldn't quite make it. But I just wanted to make a comment about Kerry herself. I've had the honor of working under Kerry's direction for many years, participating in the nutrition assessment course where I teach parts of the anthropometry component. And there was AK and BK, there's before Kerry and after Kerry. And before Kerry, other people who were in charge of the course would call up previous, for presenters and say, oh God, just do whatever you did last year. But what Kerry has done over the many years is look at every component, because she has, and make improvements on every component of the course, because she has in the rare talent of having an in-depth knowledge of every component, every aspect of nutrition assessment, of the nutrition assessment course. And I'm so very grateful for being, under Kerry's direction. When I had an issue or a problem or a question, I would always just call 911 Kerry. And she just has an in-depth knowledge. She's her professional humbleness. She's just a terrific colleague for life, for all the students who have come into contact with her. And these were her trademarks, her personal signature on everything that she does. My affiliation with Hopkins is my most cherished affiliation. Keith can certainly speak to that. We share common roots, Keith and our origins. But I'm always forever grateful for being part of this wonderful Hopkins family, and for Kerry for your direction and allowing me to participate. After my presentations, I'd always look up at Kerry and like a little child looking up for mother for approval. Did she like it? Was it okay? But every year we've made improvements, and there are times Kerry would just completely reorganize the slides and say, well, what do you think about this? I say, yeah, it's perfect. And Kerry, you have been perfect. And I want to personally thank you. I'm one of many who appreciates who you are.
Thank you, Erwin. Appreciate it.
We have time for one more question. Jean, did you have? Or, you sure? Okay. You got it.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I just had a question. It's more of a historical question, but I was wondering if, like, the famine from colonialism in Bangladesh impacted, like, micronutrient deficiencies, either through epigenetics or, like, changes in diet patterns.
Wow. I mean, that's a great question. It precedes me. I have looked at data as we are, putting some of our adolescent data into perspective, less around the micronutrient status, which I'm sure has been affected. I don't know about epigenetics, but you can see just dramatically over the last, decades since then, how adolescent growth has improved. We know that, things like education for girls has improved over the course of time that we've been doing these studies. So I think there's a lot a lot has changed, and whether we can sort of root something into that time period based on the data that we're looking at over the last, 20 years or so, it'd be hard for me to say. Keith, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. It's a big question. So, yeah.
Well, thanks again, Kerry. This was phenomenal, and we appreciate all your work and all you do, and we look forward to hearing more and more to come over the years to come. And with that, I'd like to invite everybody to a reception out at the Wall of Wonder. I think the World Cup has ended. I don't know who won, but for those of you online, thank you again for joining us. I wish you could join us here for the reception, but we'll be thinking of you. So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks again to Kerry.